Just ask everyone, since we're going to be giving testimony today, if you could turn their phones to vibrate. Thanks very much. So I'm going to start. I'm Carrie Davis, and I am the committee co-chair, the advisory board co-chair, and I'm going to send you go around. Press the right.
Yes, Asa Radix.
Hi, I'm Gretchen Van Wyk.
Paul Kodrak.
Christian Huygen from Rainbow Heights Club.
Katie Douglas.
I'm Ethan Rice, and I'm the co-chair of the board with Harry, and I don't even know how to start reading. So, also, we have just the instructions, and we're gonna have a message, and then Gretchen's gonna update everyone on the implementation of the rule change, and then after that, we'll start the public comments. And it looks like we have it set up so that you can sit here to do the public comments, so it can be recorded. And then we may have some questions for you, and then we will wrap it up. So with that,
I'll hand it over to the Center for Health Equity. And I'm sorry if my head's in the way.
Hey everyone. Oh, this is really live. Okay. So, hi, my name is Larry Tonte. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm the new LGBTQI health equity specialist. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the work of the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. So, over the past few years, the New York City Health Department and Board of Health have taken some initial steps to make our work and our services more inclusive and affirming of transgender and gender non-conforming New Yorkers. Making it easier to change the gender marker on New York City birth certificates is part of that effort. But we know that there's still a lot of work that has to be done. I work for the Center for Health Equity, and we are working closely with many divisions and bureaus across the agency, including the Bureau of HIV and AIDS, to expand DOHMH's LGBTQ work beyond an HIV and AIDS and disease prevention lens by developing strategies that address health inequities based on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, race, class, and other social positions. In the coming months, we will have identified specific program and policy interventions to better address the health equity of LGBT and gender nonconforming communities, especially as their lives and health experiences intersect with racism and neighborhood poverty. CHE is committed to translating this work to specific neighborhood level actions and effective policy change within our city agencies and citywide through collaboration with community advisory boards, local leaders, and TG&C lead service organizations. So, I'm sorry, excuse me. So as the new LGBTQI health equity specialist, you can see me as a partner for you in your efforts. And I want to make sure that you know that I can be an advocate for you in the work that we do with the Department of Health. If you're interested in learning more about CHE and the work that we're going to do with our health action centers and in our communities, we have a contact form outside next to the sign-in sheet where you are signing in for the testimonials. And you can feel free to ask me questions afterwards. Thanks a lot.
Fantastic. So, Gretchen.
Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Gretchen Van Wyk. I'm the Assistant Commissioner for the Bureau of Vital Statistics here at the Health Department, which is where we have implemented the regulation change and the law change. So I just wanted to let you know how we made this, worked on this when we did the implementation. So when it came to implementing the rule and law here in New York City, we had a sense that the rule would likely go forward in the fall of 2014, and we started, we convened a work group of individuals to get us ready to go, to go forth and really hit the ground running when the rule became effective in January of 2015. So we started a weekly work group, and we started doing things that we do here in the Bureau of Vital Statistics. So that meant developing new forms, modifying our instructions, training our staff, doing the kinds of things that we as the Vital Records Office need to think about. We also worked to make sure that our staff were really ready to support the transgender community. And so we had all staff complete a mandatory training on creating a trans-friendly workplace. We wanted to thank the the Rainbow Heights Club for providing that training. One of the members of the board, Christian Huygen, was able to lead that training for us and actually did a lot of trainings for the agency. We also built a list of over 250 transgender providers, advocates, and legal advisors from around the United States. So one of the challenges of being a vital records jurisdiction, and there are 57 of us around the country, is that when people are born in one place, doesn't mean they stay in that place. So if we want to reach people who are born in New York City, we need to actually reach out to people all across the country. So we created a list of over 250 sort of legal organizations, service providers, and medical providers across the country to have them help us raise awareness about this change. So as far as implementation goes, we've really seen an increase in the number of transgender birth certificates that we've issued. So on average, in previous years, in 2013 and 2012, we issued about 20 transgender birth certificates. So just in the year after the rule change, so that was between the 12th of January 2015 and the 12th of January in 2016, we issued 331 new birth certificates with amended gender markers. So since the rule went live, we've issued 617 as of December 14th. So we've really seen a tremendous increase, and we're really happy with that. We think that's really reaching an unmet need. With regard to the characteristics of the applications and the new issuances, the ratio, the proportion male to female is 55.9%, and the proportion that's female to male is 44.1%. And so we see that this is a more equitable distribution of requested gender marker changes. With regard to the age range of the applicants, which is, it's been 6 years to 76 years. So a guardian or a parent may request a gender marker change on behalf of their child if they would like to do that. And so that's why the range includes people under the age of 18. So we have had about, on average, people are in their mid-30s when they apply, but of course that's an average of all the ages. The most frequent age at the time of the application approval is 24. And 32 people under the age of 18 have had the gender marker changed. Over half of people live in one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. Another 8.3% live in New York State, and the rest, bless you, and the rest of the individuals who've requested the change live outside of New York. So 34 states in the U.S. and 2 countries outside of the U.S. And the average turnaround time for these is 4.23 days. I'd like to acknowledge our staff, especially Ms. Edna Timbers, who is here with us today, who's the lead staff person who's been working on these changes. So you can imagine that going from 20 of these a year to 331, that's a large change in volume, and that we've prioritized making sure that we can turn these around as quickly as possible and help people as quickly as possible through the process. So she's really responsible for a lot of that, and she's the person that people will speak to when they reach out to us. With regard to the actual people who have signed off on the affirmation or attestation of gender identity, the providers are listed here. These are those with diagnostic abilities or licensed as physicians, as nurse practitioners, social workers, psychologists, and a number of other specialties. On average, the most common provider type has been a physician, either an MD or a DO, followed by a nurse practitioner or a social worker. And then we have a variety of other types of professionals who've written the affirmations or affidavits. So this advisory board is part of the law that was passed in conjunction with the law that was passed by City Council in parallel to the gender marker change. And one of the things that this law mandated is regular meetings to assess the implementation of the actual procedure of the health department. Also, it requires a report. And so the things that will be included in the report that will be issued by this board are an assessment of the gender marker change requirement and recommendations for changes and or improvements to the requirement. And so that's something that we're looking forward to hearing from you today. We want to hear feedback on the process as you're hearing it, or as you've experienced it, and any recommendations for changes or improvements to the requirement. And we'll have the bulk of the meeting will be devoted to that, and we think, and we have a microphone set up to facilitate that. So now I'll hand it back to Carrie, and she will.
Great, thank you very much. Do we have the list of people who signed in?
Yes.
Okay.
Did anyone come in late and need to sign still? Okay.
Okay, let me grab that and hand it around.
So in general, we hope to allow, since we're running a little bit ahead of time, 3 minutes for feedback, and then we would like to have a minute or so that we can ask any questions that might be raised by your commentary. So has anybody not signed in yet? We're gonna just add those names.
And then also if you have written comments, we can take those now too, if you brought them with you or needed.
So you can hand them in as you come up, so
Yes.
you can hold on.
Or email them if you need to.
Does anybody else want to sign in or say if they're going to speak?
We actually have 2 of these we can pass around. Does anybody else need to sign in?
That appears to be it.
Nice.
Oh, oh. So really, one, two, that's it.
Is this? Okay.
Oh, great.
Okay.
So,
We only have 4 people who are in to give oral testimony, so we have plenty of time. And if anyone changes their mind, we still have time, we can check back in, I guess, at the end.
so if your commentary is a little over, it's okay. So, Patty and Patricia Harrington, I think you're the first person on the list.
I
Thank you.
just press the button so the microphone's red to record.
Hi, my name is Patricia Harrington. I'm from Transcend Legal. I'm here to read a statement by our Executive Director, Nella Lewis. Transcend Legal welcomes the opportunity to comment on the department's gender marker change requirements for New York City birth certificates. Transcend Legal is a New York City-based nonprofit that cultivates equitable social, medical, and legal recognition of transgender people by offering culturally competent transgender-led legal representation, public policy advocacy, community education and organizing, and public education. One of our areas of service is assisting with name and gender changes for New York residents, many of whom were born in New York City. We have observed various barriers to getting doctor's letters for the correction. First, providers have trouble filling out the form correctly. In an effort to be supportive, the providers often list the individual's new name on the form. Edna Timbers has informed us that it must be the name on the birth certificate, even though the form is being presented along with the name change order. There are often misspellings of the new name. One provider used the person's nickname rather than the legal name they are adopting. These errors are so common that we have taken the step of filling out the client's information on the form prior to giving it to the provider. There's also been confusion from providers about having to provide our clients with 2 separate letters, one for federal documents and one for the birth certificate. It would simplify things if New York City would accept the same letter that the federal government accepts for gender changes on federal documents such as Social Security, passports, and immigration documents. Providers who specialize in transgender care are in high demand, and writing multiple letters and correcting errors on letters adds up to a significant drain on the resources for already overworked providers. Moreover, a person may have trouble finding a supportive provider, particularly if they live in a rural area outside of New York. Finally, requiring a provider letter at all infringes on a person's rights to gender, self-determination, and privacy. state has no interest in dictating the sex designation of any particular individual. An individual's sex is best determined by that individual. While many physical factors comprise one's sex, such as chromosomes, hormone levels, and secondary sex characteristics, reproductive organs, the most important factor is one's brain sex. An individual can readily attest to whether they are male or female. A medical provider is not required for this assessment, given that knowledge ultimately rests within that individual. WPATH's 2015 statement on legal recognition of gender identity notes that in no particular medical, surgical, or mental health treatment or diagnosis is an adequate marker for anyone's gender identity, so these should not be requirements for a legal gender change. WPATH also urges governments to eliminate unnecessary barriers and to institute simple and accessible administrative procedures for transgender people to obtain legal recognition of gender consonant with each individual's identity when gender markers on identity documents are considered necessary. So we are recommending that the department adopt a procedure to change the sex designation that relies solely on an affidavit from the applicant. This procedure has been adopted in an increasing number of jurisdictions, including on NYC municipal ID cards. Pennsylvania's policy, which allows for gender corrections for transgender youth upon receipt of a notarized affidavit from the parents, serves as a helpful model. Internationally, countries such as Argentina, Denmark, Colombia, Malta, Ireland, and New Zealand have implemented self-attestation gender change policies for documents including birth certificates, national ID cards, and passports. A similar policy is moving forward in Chile. The practices of these countries inform the following best practices in gender marker changes on state-issued documents. Medical consensus favors transgender individuals being able to update their birth certificates even without undergoing any particular medical treatment. WPATH advocates for amendments without requiring surgery. The American Psychological Association resolved in 2008 that it encourages legal and social recognition of transgender individuals consistent with their gender identity and expression, including access to identity documents consistent with their gender identity and expression, which do not involuntarily disclose their status as transgender for transgender people who permanently socially transition to another gender role. The American Medical Association adopted a policy in 2014 supporting elimination of any government requirement that a transgender individual undergo surgery in order to amend a birth certificate. Birth certificates exist apart from the intimate and private nature of medical treatments for transgender individuals, and the AMA resolution recognizes that states should not be concerned with the fullness of physical changes, but rather the individual's intrinsic gender when acknowledging their transgender identity on updated legal documents. The National Association of Social Workers has also stated that it supports the legal recognition of transgender individuals as members of the gender with which they identify, regardless of the assigned sex at birth or subsequent surgical or other medical interventions. And in conclusion, we'd just like to urge the board to adopt a self-attestation policy. If that's not possible, we also just recommend that the letter be standardized so that people don't have confusion filling it out. And on a personal note, I changed my birth certificate in 2015. The process was very smooth. I got it back in a week or so. But since I transitioned in 2000, I've had to get 8 different therapists and doctors letters over the years to change various documents, and all those letters have different texts. So I'd just like to say thank you to the board for implementing this policy, but I think it can be differently improved. Thank you.
Can you stay for 1 moment?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
So, does anybody on the advisory board have any questions for Penny? That was really well reasoned and concise.
Well, actually, that was Noah. So I'm taking credit for Noah's work.
But you're part of the organization, so I appreciate it. So, our colleagues. Well, I have a question. So, self-attestation was an issue that many of us have discussed and testified to back when the law was being considered. I know that a number of medical organizations are now looking at using informed consent as a way to offer care. Do you think that asking a mental health or medical provider to determine that someone has the ability to offer and has the presence of mind and ability to offer consent and therefore change their birth certificate, would that be less onerous than a medical provider attesting to someone's actual gender, which I don't believe they could do?
It would be,
Is your light on?
sorry, it would be less onerous, but I still think it's just another step and another letter that someone has to write. And so, what we see is that the more forms and letters people have to fill out, the more confusion there is and the more difficulty people have actually getting things changed.
Thank you very much.
Bobby Hodgson, Robert Hodgson, I should say your formal name for these formal proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
And just turn on that.
Yes. Hi. So yes, I'm Bobby Hodgson. I'm a staff attorney at the New York Civil Liberties Union. And the NCLU, we welcome the opportunity to comment on the implementation of the revised policy regarding the correction of gender markers on birth certificates. We recognize that this rule change has removed outdated and severely discriminatory surgical requirements that had prevented many transgender and gender non-conforming New Yorkers from obtaining a corrected birth certificate, and that it put in place a policy that instead requires obviously a letter from one of any number of licensed providers confirming that a gender marker correction is necessary. Particularly after hearing the update at the beginning of this meeting, we applaud the fact that since the rule is updated, an increased number of New Yorkers have been able to access the benefits of an identity document that accurately reflects their gender. However, I think we're going to echo a lot of the comments that were made by Transcend Legal. We think that this policy could be further strengthened and that remaining barriers to access could be removed by aligning New York City's birth certificate gender marker policy with the more appropriate policy that is already successfully employed in the context of New York City's municipal ID and in the broader context of the New York City human rights law, which is self-attestation. We think that policy is efficient, is accurate, is protective of the rights of transgender and gender non-conforming New Yorkers, and that it properly recognizes that an individual's gender is best determined by that individual. We submitted written comments that are a little longer than what I'm going to say now, but again, I will echo some of the things that were brought out by Transcend Legal. When New York City established its most recent form of city-issued identification, essentially, when it had a clean slate from which to build in the municipal ID card, the City Council adopted a very straightforward gender marker policy that allows people to simply self-attest to their own gender. The policy has been successful and uncontroversial, and it recognizes, as I said, that an individual's gender is best determined by that individual. We also note that it's in keeping with City Commission on Human Rights guidance, stating that asking for proof of a person's gender as a condition for them accessing, for example, sex-segregated facilities or programs is itself a form of discrimination. So because of that, we note that asking for proof in the context of a birth certificate gender marker change seems to be out of keeping with existing city policy and potentially the city human rights law. Similarly, we note that other agencies, for example, the Department of Homeless Services, will mandate that an individual's self-reported gender determine their placement in a single-sex homeless shelter, for example. So all these policies are consistent, efficient, and again, we would say accurate and sort of the most protective of people's rights. By contrast, even a policy like the current birth certificate rule, with its broad definition of the proof necessary to establish a person's gender, does leave in place lingering barriers that are unnecessary and invasive, and I think a lot of them were listed in the previous testimony. So in light of these systemic barriers and continuing barriers, and of the city's successful implementation of a self-attestation standard in so many other contexts, and in light of other jurisdictions like the ones mentioned previously to have adopted this, we would recommend that the department consider adopting a similar policy of self-attestation for birth certificates. So, thank you, and I'd welcome any questions.
Thank you, Bobby. Does anyone have any questions?
I'm gonna ask the same question I asked Patty. Would determining someone's ability to give informed consent be better, worse, the same?
I think I'll probably answer it in a similar manner, and that it would be better, though sort of in acknowledging the fact that it is a person who determines their own gender, and then you are not, you are not working under the assumption that it is someone else who is determining that. But I would point out that I think it's still very inconsistent with all the policies that we pointed out, where again there has been no problem and there are no abuses of a system where a person can attest to their own gender and is by default considered competent to do so. We're living in a world where the City Commission on Human Rights is already enforcing a law that says you have to respect a person's self-reported gender in all of the contexts in our daily life in which it's relevant. So to create a separate barrier when a person is trying to access something so fundamental, again, when even something that is less onerous is still onerous enough to prevent even one person from accessing that change, it seems unnecessary and ultimately inconsistent with the rest of the city policy.
Can I ask a question? Thank you very much for your testimony. This may go outside of your knowledge, and that's okay, and it may not be relevant to the question at hand, but to the extent that the NYCID and its self-attestation basis is a precedent that's of interest, are you aware of anybody having a negative experience showing an ID that, I mean, I'm also aware that it's male, female, or no gender marker, so it would be maybe perhaps less likely that somebody might have a negative experience with someone in authority seeing that ID. Are you aware of anything like that happening?
I'm not aware of anything like that happening. That's not to say that it's not happening right now. And I think I want to make sure I understand your question. You're saying someone who's asking for the ID.
Right, I show ID that has no gender marker and somebody hassles me in some way. I have some kind of negative experience in some way.
I'm not aware of that. And I point out the fact that there are many forms of IDs, student IDs that exist, city IDs that exist, employee IDs that exist, that people are used to already seeing that don't have gender markers. So it's not generally, exceptional to look at that and see that that's the case. But I won't speak for anyone, and we don't have any specific data on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
So, Kyle, I'm sorry, Kyle.
Tyler again.
Thank you, Kyle.
And I only put up 3, but definitely should. Then I emailed them as well.
Okay, that's.
Okay.
We'll pass.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kyle Opinion. I'm a staff attorney at the Silver Barrel Law Project. I'm here representing the Peter Cisano Youth Project and Legal Services New York City. We're submitting these comments to the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene in order to promote self-attestation of gender, sex, similar to ID NYC that Transcend and NICLU have already affirmed. We're also submitting these comments to have the option to select a non-binary designation, both for intersex and gender non-conforming and non-binary individuals. And we're also submitting these comments to go forward with fee waivers for low-income New Yorkers to obtain and correct their birth certificates. So despite significant policy changes, the vast majority of New York City-born trans people have inaccurate birth certificates. Previous to current policy, the majority of trans women and men did not have the surgeries the New York City 1971 policy required. While the current policy is an outstanding achievement to the tireless advocacy of trans, gender nonconforming, and intersex communities, there are 3 concrete steps the department can now take to dramatically improve the lives of TG and CI people. PCRIP, SRLP, and LISNY are 3 direct legal service providers that fought alongside other folks for the current law and who now submit these additional comments. As the department knows, the birth certificate is a key that unlocks a number of important doors. It's a living document that's used on a regular basis to participate in society. It is a prerequisite to getting other IDs that is often the only form of ID that low-income New Yorkers have access to when applying for jobs, health insurance, or enrolling in school. While the current list of providers who can affirm or attest the correct gender encompasses many different types of healthcare professionals, limiting or restricting to the set list of providers severely harms the people who most need an affirming ID. As the success of the ID NYC shows, gender self-determination and self-attestation is the key to prevent discrimination and harassment, and not the reliance on a third-party medical provider. Moreover, trans people are often unable to access adequate medical care due to a combination of discrimination, unemployment, and lack of health insurance, thus preventing them from getting the affirmation. TG and CI people are less likely to have health insurance and are more likely to delay medical treatment due to discrimination or inability to pay for medical services. And about 17% of trans New Yorkers have been denied medical care simply for being transgender. Revising the policy after the successes that we've seen is a positive step towards continuing to improve the lives of TG and CI people who've been excluded from participating in society on the basis of an inaccurate piece of paper. All people should be able to correct the sex on their birth certificate by their own decision and not the decision of others. Our recommendation is self-attestation. TG and CI people still face barriers getting the correct sex designated on their birth certificate. The current policy states that a medical provider must identify a person's gender, and if the provider is not a DO or an MD, that statement must be notarized. Many people have trouble finding a competent provider, let alone a provider who will fill out these forms. Moreover, the fact that the form must be notarized, even if it's a medical provider, creates additional confusion, miscommunication, and hurdles when attempting to get this affidavit. We've heard, for example, that one major hospital corporation doesn't even have a notary on staff available for individuals. Many of my clients have come to me with the correct form filled out, but not notarized, and I have to say, go back. This has created significant barriers to patients of that hospital accessing the correct birth certificate. It also infringes on the person's right to gender self-determination and privacy. We want to point out the state of Nevada, who recently updated their birth certificate policy to permit self-attestation. Individuals can change their sex in Nevada by submitting an affidavit stating the gender requested and a second affidavit from someone who knows the person or other verifiable evidence confirming the facts of the evidence submitted. The second affidavit can be from anyone who has personal knowledge of the person's gender, which may include a first-hand personal, familial, medical, or professional relationship. And as other organizations have testified internationally, this is becoming the standard as well. Therefore, we recommend that Department of Mental Health and Hygiene adopt a procedure to change the sex relying solely on the affidavit of an applicant. This procedure would mirror the gender policy of IDNYC. It would be with an affidavit, but still, and permit a change with minimal intrusion by the government or the medical community. We also really want to hammer that non-binary designations are the way to go as well. Current New York City policy limits gender designation to either male or female, and it does not permit the designation of sex to be unspecified, non-binary, or an X or other designations. This policy leaves out intersex people, gender non-conforming people, and other people who identify outside the constructed gender binary. And just so we're on the same page, gender non-conforming is an umbrella term for people who do not identify along a constructed gender binary. Gender non-conforming people may identify as combinations of gender, as no gender at all, or as varying genders thereafter. And gender non-conforming and intersex people who do not identify on a gender binary may use the singular pronouns they, them, and their, or other third-person gender pronouns, or the pronouns that they prefer. Currently, there's no option for a non-binary designation with the New York City birth certificate, even though many intersex and gender non-conforming people would welcome and actively are requesting the change. Other jurisdictions are moving in the direction of permitting a non-binary designation. For instance, in the state of Oregon, a court order was just issuing Jamie Sharp's gender to be non-binary. The judge ordered the Department of Motor Vehicles to issue a state ID with the sex designation of Jamie to be listed as X. Moreover, in California, Sarah Keenan became the second non-binary person when a Santa Cruz decision ordered her gender to be corrected to non-binary. As advocates, we have been working with Sarah, and while she won her case, California has only offered her an intersex birth certificate, rather than a designation that would welcome her identity as a gender non-conforming person. These general principles are also mirrored in federal regulations which signify that non-binary people are to be free from discrimination and prejudice by the government and by private and public actors. Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act states that discrimination on the basis of gender identity for federally funded healthcare providers is prohibited by law, and this section specifies that a person's gender may be male, female, neither, a combination of male or female. Moreover, the Federal Registrar's website provides more context on why the section reads that way, stating the insertion of this clause helps clarify that those individuals with non-binary gender identities are also protected under federal law. The third recommendation, the third recommendation is for fee waivers. Transgender people face disproportionate poverty, 15% compared to 4% of the general population. They cannot afford to order the birth certificates which is needed to file a name change petition, hampering their ability to get correct documentation. They also cannot afford to correct their birth certificate following a name or gender change. Most recent reports indicate that discrimination and poverty faced by non-binary people and gender non-conforming people is also quite alarming. The uncompromising processing fee of $40 in addition to $15 for a new certificate is out of step and an undue burden for low-income New Yorkers, especially low-income New Yorkers who are also people of color, teaching in CI, and surviving underground economies. While some legal service providers pay for this $55 fee, including SRLP, PCRP, and LISNY, the fee is significant, and the cost is unduly prohibitive to many people, especially people not connected to social services or to the LGBT community. Therefore, please consider adopting a policy for free or reduced fee certified copies and corrections for low-income individuals. The New York Division of Criminal Justice Services, for example, allows fee waivers for criminal history record checks when presented with an affidavit of hardship or a CBIC card, a benefit card. The best policy to adopt would be a core affidavit of financial hardship, as it would be the easiest for low-income people to obtain and retain, unlike a benefit card which is often lost or stolen. So in conclusion, New York City should continue to modernize its birth certificate policy by following the recommendations of transgender, intersex, and gender non-conforming people who've come forward today with specific requests that you focus on self-attestation, providing fee waivers for low-income people, and recognizing the gender identities of non-binary and gender non-conforming New Yorkers. We also applaud this work by calling for this public hearing, and I hope you continue to work with the most affected by this policy. Thank you.
Great testimony, and I appreciate it. Thank you. I'd like to ask colleagues if there are any questions or feedback.
So I had a question around the non-binary designation. Are there any places internationally that are doing that, and exactly what is put on the birth certificate?
That's a great question. We submitted kind of longer comments to the board, but the states, the countries that are following that are Germany, Australia, Nepal, France in part, Pakistan, New Zealand. In some of these countries, there is a third sex option that folks are required to select. In other countries, there's the option. In other countries, they require people to list as intersex. We would recommend that there's a designation of either non-binary or a designation that people can self-select for themselves. But it definitely is since gender is socially constructed, all these different countries have different answers to these problems. So it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all as much as we would want the department to adopt a policy that would best affirm and reflect the genders that people have. That's a great question.
Other questions?
I'm just gonna follow up on that. Are there, for intersex communities, a specific gender marker or a specific term that are preferred? And is that different than, I know I spoke to some people who you referenced in here, and I know some people are getting intersex on birth certificates or an X. For some people that's not appropriate, even if they're not intersex, or even if they are, that's not what they want. So I was just wondering if there's a difference or if there's a consensus on any of these things for document purposes. But I know everyone may have a different way that they'd like to self-designate, and I think that would be the best way to do it, but if there's any consensus right now, that's fair.
I would say that I don't believe that there is consensus. I think, from public comment and from looking at best practices and looking at what Oregon, California is doing and looking at what the organizations are responding to best reflect people's gender identities, that's where that key would be. I think X, non-binary, gender non-conforming, non-designated, those are all better options than what is currently there, which is male or female. And that just does not encompass people's actual identities.
I just want to make a correction. So just so that in terms of the process, actually undetermined, unknown, and are allowed markers on this, and intersex is interpreted to be one of the allowable categories. Sorry.
I
Do you
and
know,
I have,
do you know if people are gonna correct to unknown or non-designated?
I haven't, that would be totally, that would be fine. We don't usually get that. What usually happens is parents, it sounds like, from my understanding of what happens in hospitals at the time of birth, is parents work with the doctors, and it's more that on their interest, or they have an interest in selecting one of the male or female. But those are the categories, the response categories.
But just to follow up on that, if someone now, if I wanted to change my birth certificate now, could I have it one of those indeterminate categories? I'm not born in this.
Yeah. So my understanding is, and I haven't looked at one of these cases, so we'd have to have, I'm just thinking, looking to Ms. Timbers, and I believe that would be it. Those were the 4 response categories that we have in our system. So we'd have to look at it. Like I said, we haven't had one of those applications, but it has come to my attention. So that's
For us.
review them when we have intersects we can do.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Kate?
Curious if you had any sense of the cases that you mentioned with individuals in California and Oregon who were able to get non-gender binary designations on their birth certificate. Any sense of how that impacted their access to health insurance and being registered for health insurance and getting health care? Just curious about the implementation of that for people's health care. Do you have any information on that?
I don't have as much information about those specific examples, but I do know that in New York City, in New York State, you can have a gender exception code, like a billing code added to the databases for New York State of Health or for HRA, which allow cross-sex payment for sex-specific billing issues, so that folks won't be denied procedures based on their gender marker, which is the way to go.
Any other questions before we?
I had one. I know folks who have the X designation from overseas and on their passports, and when they tried to apply for US visas, they actually were denied visas because they said you can. So I'm just thinking forward, like for folks who have something other than M or F, applying for passports and things like that, what happens?
That's a really great point. So we also submitted this in our comments, but there's a federal case happening right now brought by Land Legal in Colorado, Zim versus Carey, that the district court ordered the Department of Homeland Security to shore up their record and prove that there is a reasonable basis to deny a gender marker of X on their passports. And so now that's pending in federal court. So the Department of Homeland Security came to federal court and they said, well, this is the policy it's always been, and there's no reason to have a change policy, and there's only male, female genders, and other countries do X, but we don't ever do that, even though it wasn't required until 1976, so things like that. So the district court was, okay, you should come back with better reasoning. And so it's interesting to see how that case plays out. And also, if things change with the Department of Homeland Security, I think that would affect the visa requirements. But I also think that just because there might be difficulties down the road doesn't mean that New York City can't be at the forefront to actually respect and affirm people's identities with a piece of paper. That's so critical. And if folks are having trouble with visas or anything like that, that's a complication down the road, but that doesn't mean that New York City should get in the way of affirming people's IDs at this critical step that the board has the power to change.
And I just was gonna respond also to that, if that's okay, or we can let you
Oh, no,
go.
go ahead.
That's fine. But, so yes, Kyle did a really good job explaining that part, but I do think, well, we don't know what the Department of Homeland Security is gonna be like very soon, or maybe we do. So, I think there was a good chance they might go back and revise that policy. There might not be at this point, but I still think that case is gonna be moving forward no matter what. So I think there's a good chance sometime soon, given this case, that the US is gonna have to recognize non-binary gender identities on their passports. I don't think it's gonna be really long off for there to probably be required to do that, but in this case, I might be wrong, so we don't know. And I also had another thought, but I forgot what it was. All right, I'll come back to it.
All right, so thank you very much, that was great.
Thank you.
Sorry.
And, welcome, Miller.
Hi, I am not an attorney. I don't work for any legal company. I am simply a mom of a 9.5-year-old non-binary child. My child is Cole Miller. And I have their express permission to be here and to represent them. They also submitted their own testimony in writing. Cole announced that they were a boy and a girl when they were 2.5 years old, even though the doctor said at birth, it's a girl. I didn't pause for even 1 second before saying okay. I had questions about gender and identity growing up. I was raised in a very right-wing, fundamentalist religious cult. I was not allowed to be who I am as a queer person, and I ended up being excommunicated from my community because of who I am. I could never consider being my child's first bigot, as my parents were to me. Being completely supportive of my child, I would do anything in my power to help them feel more secure and valid in a very unjust world. I had to advocate on my child's behalf so that they would could use their chosen name in school rather than their given name. I had to fight to get their school to use preferred pronouns, which are they and them. I had to plead for my child to be given access to a restroom, which they could use comfortably without the fear of being told they were in the wrong one. I had to fight to get the school to stop lining kids up in boy or girl lines and made them discontinue the practice of having separate boy and girl tables for lunch. At my child's after-school program, I had to ask them to change the rules for their dance party and allow kids to dance with who they want, rather than separating them by gender. My child has been very patient and has had to deal with a lot of things that no 9.5-year-old should have to ever face. We live in New York State, one of the most progressive states in the U.S., and we're still not the first ones to allow marriage between like-gendered people. We don't have a box on our birth certificate that allows people to say that I'm neither female nor male or both or whatever. And it makes them feel invalid. It's disrespectful. It doesn't go with the standards that we have set for our state as one that embraces free thinking and open-mindedness. It's time to allow people to state who they are and not have doctors or parents decide on their child's gender based solely on the lack or presence of certain genitalia. If we need to have a box for gender at all, we should have a box for those who are neither F nor M and fitting into that line.
Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions?
Well, you said your child submitted testimony. Do you
Yes.
want to read that?
Sure.
I think that would be really nice. Thank you.
My name is Cole Miller. I was born on April 1st, 2007. The doctor said it's a girl. However, when I was 2.5 years old, I told my mom I'm a boy and a girl. My mom never questioned me and always accepted me for who I was and who I am. My mom has helped me fight for my rights at school by making sure the staff receive training to use my preferred pronouns, they and them. Right now, I'm legally changing my name to the one I have been using for 2 years. I'm hoping to be able to legally change my gender to non-binary on my birth certificate and passport. I feel like I'm being forced to be a boy or a girl. New York is one of the most progressive states. My kid listens to me a lot. And people should be able to be who they feel they are. This is why I think there should be a box for non-binary.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Any other questions? Thank you. Very good. Is that it for the testimony? All right. So this is our time for conclusion. I actually have a question for you, Gretchen.
Okay.
When does this advisory board's sunset or end?
I believe it's the end of 2018. Yeah.
Okay, good. I feel like we have some work to do.
Yeah. And we also have a report due in March.
Yes,
Our report in March.
can you tell a little bit, can you
Oh,
tell
sure.
the room a little bit about that?
So the report will include, so the sections, and the sections are laid out by the law.
And the law says that it should include an assessment of the gender marker change requirement, which will include the evaluation of transgender people's access to providers for affirmation, utilization of requirement change among the transgender community, the number of applicants and the processing time, the impact on access to health care and other services, and the reduction, if any, in discrimination against transgender people. The second large category is recommendations for changes and or improvements to the requirement. And for that part, the subsections are best practices among policies for gender marker changes and actions taken by the Bureau in response to recommendations.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. So I want to again thank everyone who testified, and it was very informative and moving at times, and really stuck to our 3 questions: have the regulations reduce barriers? And I think your report earlier showed how barriers have fallen away, but what additional barriers exist? You guys testified to that and gave comment, and then you gave really powerful recommendations for change. And so we appreciate that. My colleagues, do they have any summary comments to make? They have a chance now.
I just really want to thank everybody for coming and being here. 4 o'clock on Monday is always an easy time for people who are working to come and make it a part of their work to give comments on these issues, but I really appreciate it, and it was very helpful.
All right, well, I think then we can close this meeting.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.